this is a good one. This will unlock this and create a pipeline of projects that will help enable that. And this, we need, this has not been mapped out or thought through. And so
the CEO of an Arctic think tank appears before the Foreign Affairs Committee and informs them that no one has thought through the strategic infrastructure of Canada's north. And I'm here to tell her I have, so all you have to do is ask. Welcome back to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. Two different House committees had experts on Arctic sovereignty and Arctic infrastructure in front of them last week. One of the experts was before the Foreign Affairs Committee talking about strategic infrastructure. And I am going to be talking to you about the strategic infrastructure that this individual was referring to. Regular long-term viewers of this channel know that I have a position on how to unlock the North, how to tie it all together, and how to make it strong and impenetrable. Many of you who have just arrived will have heard me make a joke, but I was only a little bit joking and I'm mostly serious. I do believe I have the answer. And I do believe that if this individual were to ask me, I would provide her with all of the ins and outs and the subtle nuances that are required to solve this issue. However, before we get into it, I would encourage all of you to share this with this individual on her Twitter feed or wherever she happens to be so that I can get her to hear it directly from me. All right, let's check it out. I will leave a link to the committee in the description. The committee witness is her name is Jessica Shadian, and she's the CEO and president of a think tank known as Arctic 360, who addresses these concerns and these problems, or at least has been tasked with trying to come up with a way to address these issues and these concerns. Now, just to tell you right out of the gate, the problem is that we cannot get out any of our supplies, that most of our north is not developed, that China covets our north, that Russia is pushing in through the north, that the United States has an eye on Greenland, that country already looks after Greenland, and Canada has been looking to the south for so long that we have neglected to unlock the northern part of our country. I have traversed many parts of the topography. One of the biggest issues of this particular problem is the landscape itself. I will get into that. First, let's hear Mrs. Shadian say some of her opening statement.
15 years ago, the Chinese ambassador to Norway gave an Arctic Council reception speech before a balcony of onlookers explaining the Arctic's importance for China's national interest, wrapped in a climate science bow. So this is not new. Yes, for over a decade, Russia has modernized its Arctic infrastructure and military capabilities to develop resources and control regional access. My simple question, why aren't we doing the same? Our allied Arctic neighbors also spent the past decade modernizing Arctic infrastructure and developing resources. The U.S. Department of Energy recently acquired 5% equity stake in Canadian company Lithium Americas, followed by a White House announcement that DoD is taking 10% equity stake in Canadian Trilogy Metals, with aims for another 7%. The U.S.-Ukraine Reconstruction Partnership Fund gives the U.S. 50% of royalties, license fees, and payments from minerals, hydrocarbons, and related infrastructure development projects, and first choice to acquire them. The Armenian-Azerbaijan Transit Corridor, a U.S. 99-year lease, aims to develop energy, critical infrastructure, and digital technologies. The Northwest Territories Fortune Minerals already has received U.S. Pentagon funding. And this is just all aside from China.
All of that to say, those are some, and no shade on the Americans, but she's listing off the strategic threats that may be looming for Canada. We have at least 3 of our mining operations who have recently been either funded from the Department of Defense or bought wholesale, like 10%, going up to 17% or 5%. Of course, the inference with the United States is the fact that they have an eye on Greenland, and that Navy may then very well decide that it wants to move through our Arctic zones along with the Chinese and along with the Russians. On a side note, I'll get to covering it in a different video, but the United States just signed a deal with Finland for 14 icebreakers. Russia has the largest fleet of icebreakers in the world. Canada doesn't seem to have any, and we don't have a government that knows what they are doing when it comes to procurement or any such thing. However, what we just heard in the opening statement was that China covets our north, China covets our resources, China covets all of our critical minerals. Russia and China are on the same team. Russia also covets those things. The United States would have no problem whatsoever, sort of looking after the North for us, to put it in gentle terms. There's the talk of 51. There's the idea that many parts of our northern country, the northern part of our country, are not accessible to anything other than airplanes. And all of these things need to be addressed so that we can secure the sovereignty of the North. And that is something that I have been talking about ever since I heard, like I have thought about it most of my life. Like I've given 20 years thought to it, honestly. Like, as a side project when you're just sitting around, as people do. But then I heard Wab Kinew pull electricity out of the United States and offer to send it to Nunavik, where on his way to Nunavik, it's going to be supplying electricity to some mines. And it was at that point that I made a video about how really what we should be doing when we tie many of these systems together. However, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'll cover that in a minute. Let's hear what else this witness had to say.
Critical infrastructure is just hands down. We can't do anything without the infrastructure there. And so there is now effort, we see it in the defense policy update, to look at things from a multi-purpose infrastructure perspective. And the federal government is paying attention. What I think is not known at this point is how we're going to fund some of these big projects. They're enormous. They're going to cost a lot of money. And so how is that going to happen? But I also think we are not talking about it with the right lens, in the sense that we need to be future-proofing. So we need to have our infrastructure censored, embedded with AI, and be able to then meet kind of this next generation of transportation infrastructure, because we should be world leaders in cold weather innovations. And we're not. We've got non-Arctic and Arctic states that are far ahead of us. Well, we need to be strategic, and so we need to figure out what our plan is first before we can have a timetable for anything. For about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, several of us from Arctic 360, we've been shopping around with the federal government. We have it already. We're trying to put together an interactive mapping tool that would basically first inventory the transportation, energy, and telecommunications infrastructure that we have, because it doesn't sit in one space, it doesn't sit in one entity into itself, but also then try to overlay that with proposed projects that are being named, but also not named.
Okay, let's talk about a couple of things. First, she says that there are non-Arctic countries that are ahead of us. I'm sure she's inferring China, because China is not an Arctic country. Canada has the longest coastline in the world, which means we have the longest Arctic coastline in the world. And all we have to defend it is some kayaks. So it's probably something that we should be considering. Now, she's talking about critical infrastructure. She's talking about protecting the critical infrastructure with sensors. She doesn't mean, censor it, keep it quiet. She means censor it so that we can know if something happened, if there was an earthquake, or if somebody was cutting through it, or what have you. That's the kind of stuff that she's referring to. There is some concerns when we talk about going north. And before I touch on that, I just want to say she spent 5 or 6 years mapping, and you might think to yourself, well, what a colossal waste of time. However, not every province, but every province from Labrador to British Columbia touches the Arctic, touches the north, right? I mean, not Newfoundland, though it gets cold there, I'm sure, not Nova Scotia, not PEI, not New Brunswick, but the rest of them. So appreciate that when you're looking at some part of the Arctic, the telephone and electricity is going to be coming out of Alberta. They will have negotiated a deal with Alberta. Then you move along 500 kilometers and a deal has been negotiated with Manitoba. Then you cross over the James Bay and the deal has been negotiated with Quebec. On top of the electricity, we're talking about water, we're talking about internet, we're talking about all kinds of things. So that she was able to map that out is something that could go a long way to solving some of this problem. Of course, I have stated from the beginning how to solve this problem, which is why I drilled down on Churchill, because I understand a couple of things. First of all, ships don't take as long to travel on the top of the planet as they do in the middle of the planet. It's quicker. That's why so many planes fly north and then come back down, because the distances are closer together. I understand that we can get Manitoba to agree to put in a deep water port at Churchill because it helps Canada with infrastructure. It helps Canada with strategic. We can put boats there. I have a video on this, so many of the regular listeners will already know this. But for those of you that are new, and for Ms. Shady, and should she ever see this, she can understand that I have given this some serious consideration. So we start with the pipeline, which we can get from private investment. We also can get a deep water port built with tax dollars and private investment. With the deep water port, we need to include a shipyard. So right out of the gate, we've got a shipyard, we've got a dock, and we have like a harbor, and we have a pipeline. So we have all kinds of industry there, which means that we have people who need to build houses. We have people who need to get supplied with water. We have people that need to get supplied with internet. We need electricity. We need all of these things. We need to be able to supply it, which is, of course, why I mentioned putting the magnetic levitation out of Manitoba, because we can now spread out some of the investment. In addition to that, people overlook the fact that there is a lot of freight that travels into Winnipeg. Winnipeg has an enormous amount of train lines because it comes out of Chicago and it goes all the way out to the West Coast. So there's a lot of freight that comes into Winnipeg, into southern Manitoba. If we were to build the structure there, currently the train goes through Saskatchewan and then up into Churchill. And every time it gets cold, the ground freezes and that train moves. Now, for those of you that might be having a hard time catching up, or maybe I'm being too convoluted or too far ahead of myself, let me lay out something for you. When you build a pipeline, you can put it underground, you can put it on top. And when you lay cable for internet or any of the other things, you can put it up and down. When you lay a train on a rail system, you have to bury it. You have to put down all kinds of concrete, all kinds of gravel, and it is subject to water coming in, washing out that gravel, flooding, too much freezing. You can't move in the wintertime. It's got to go forward with a plow on it. There are a lot of concerns and a lot of problems. And one of the primary reasons that they travel it through Saskatchewan is because they cannot get it through all of the, let's call it, lakes and woods of this one particular part of Manitoba. It's pretty wet there, and it's just not economically viable. It helps to pick up some of the freight that's coming out of Saskatchewan, I'll grant you. However, what we need to be considering is why I mentioned the magnetic levitation is not to move people around. I say magnetic levitation, everybody thinks I'm talking about a subway to get to work. No, I'm talking about moving freight there. I'm talking about supplying them with groceries. I'm talking about supplying them with drinking water. I'm talking about supplying them with televisions and material that they need to build houses. And I'm talking about supplying them. I'm talking about turning the magnetic levitation into a freight train. All trains are made for freight. I know many of you want to think about the steam train with the going out west to the out west in the United States of America, but that train wasn't put there so people could move out west. That train was put there so they could bring the cattle back. The cattle was out there, everybody was making cows, and then they needed a train to move the cattle into Chicago. They needed a train to move the cattle backwards. Once you have the magnetic levitation established as a freight train, people will begin to use it as a passenger train, and that's what we call development. That's what she is referring to when she says that we have to think our way through this. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of structure will it make, and how will it help us, assist us in the future? But I know I have a lot of people that have come at me telling me that I don't know what I'm talking about, and I didn't want to argue over it. I just wanted to point out to you that this is something that would work. Now, the difference, of course, the primary difference between a high-speed rail, even if it does go 300 kilometers an hour, a regular rail, which wouldn't do anywhere near that, both of those trains that I just mentioned are susceptible to weather, flooding, all kinds of things. A magnetic levitation can travel in any weather. And because there is no downward force, because there's no friction on the lines, you can build it on pilings. So you don't need to lay down mile after mile after mile after mile of gravel and concrete. You simply can put footings down like a tree. It could have the same footprint of a tree because there's no downward force, there's no R factor, there's no friction. It'll hold so much weight depending on the amount of magnets. Now, because it's magnets, it is also electric, which means that you can drag the lines with you. We need to have more jobs in this country, so we are already talking about putting a pipeline. How are we going to be moving the freight to Churchill? How are we going to be moving the men along the pipeline? How are we going to be doing all of this stuff? Well, it turns out that what we should do is install a magnetic levitation so that we can assist in the freight that we require to build these projects that I'm talking about. Once we have Churchill as an established hub, we then spider web across the Arctic, which again, we can't really put a train there because the ground is frozen solid, but we can put a magnetic levitation there, again, with pilings. Of course, it is really frozen up there, and many parts of it are what they call permanently frozen or permafrost, which only lends my idea to, gives it more strength because it will be less difficult to put it across the vast distances of the north. That will unlock all of the north. We can spider web off of that once we get it up there. However, let's listen to a little bit more about what Ms. Shadian has to say.
An issue here is that you can't just build an energy project without then having telecommunications because you need to have fiber. So in order for to have energy secure, you need the grids need to be secure. So everything is interrelated. Even if you're going to build a base in the north, and even if there's only 10 people that come, well, that requires more water, more energy, more telecommunications. Institutional investors and others can start looking and saying, you know what, actually, if we go with this first, this is a good one. This will unlock this and create a pipeline of projects that will help enable that. And this, we need, this has not been mapped out or thought through. And so we're getting back to the infrastructure thing. So we got to figure out then how we're going to have the, adequate energy, telecommunications, water, all the surrounding infrastructure. I mean, there's a housing crisis in the north. There is a housing crisis in the north as well. And so we just need to think, I think, more holistically. And I've said it in the past, I definitely do not think that trickle-down infrastructure, if we do the defense infrastructure, it'll all just kind of fall into place for communities. But I don't think that's necessary to even think that way. If we think in a multi-purpose fashion, we are going to be addressing, and we're strategic, we would be able to address the economic and the defense and the social infrastructure needs together.
Which is exactly what I'm talking about. She's saying she doesn't believe the trickle-down will work because Mark Carney's trying to say if we spend money on the military, on the NATO things, then eventually the rest of the housing and whatnot will fall through or will pop up around it. Of course, that never works that way. Oftentimes people are moved in and out of military bases and they don't really put down that permanence that you're talking about. However, when they put a pipeline in a refinery, they often have a lot of people who live there for a long, long time, which of course brings me back to Churchill. Now, remember that it's not just the pipeline that I'm referring to. Wab Kinew has already committed to building electricity lines into Nunavik, right? So he's already going to be putting a lot of construction in there. There's already an established rail line that can be replaced. Unlike Mark Carney, I'm trying to think of the big picture. Now, we can take any rail system anywhere in this country and call it part of our NATO infrastructure. Many, many, many countries of this world move a lot of military stuff along freights. You won't find any military analyst on this earth that will ignore the importance of of rail to the military infrastructure of any country, the strategic infrastructure. So whether it be a magnetic levitation or a road, it works exactly the same in that respect. However, once you build a deep water port with a shipyard and the LNG refinery and have the pipeline and have Wab Kinew and Manitoba supplying electricity, you have a lot of people working a lot of good paying jobs, which of course spills out into a larger town, into a city. We need to be building icebreakers. That's why I want to ensure that we put a shipyard in Churchill, because what better place to build them than right there? We are building 2 of them in Finland. It's not enough. They're mostly made of steel. I wonder if we know any country right now that has a real need to sell its steel. Also, there is a lot of talk about putting down fiber optic cables under the ocean. Russia planted a flag down there. China's moving submarines through. There are non-Arctic countries that have cold weather technology better than ours. We bought some firearms for the northern militia. The stocks of the guns didn't work. They bent in the cold, if you can imagine that. There is a real need for Canada to be putting itself in the cold weather. There is a real need for Canadians to be developing the North. Now, the North currently has a lot of problems. It has a housing problem because it can't get materials there. There's a ship that sails out of Montreal, like I think it's, let's call it October, and then nothing again until February because most of Churchill is frozen, like the Georgian Bay is frozen. So we have to think about how we can develop not only the infrastructure of these, big projects that I'm mentioning, but also to allow that to fill out the lives of the people that are up there, to allow them to move at greater distances, to allow Churchill and the Yukon to be tied together, or Whitehorse to be tied together, which of course then can go downward into Vancouver or into Edmonton. And ultimately, we will be able to move the country, tie the country together, and freight will be able to travel amongst all of those areas. And then eventually people will be able to travel, which should make what I'm describing should make the environmentalists happy as a clam, because right now we do all of that. We supply it with airplanes. We supply it with jets that then we transfer it onto these tiny little bush planes, what they call bush planes. You've seen it they're just little planes, because they either have to land on small runways or they have to land in the water. And they are not capable of moving the enormous amounts of freight that we're talking about to develop the North. But we have a real need to develop the North rather than have the Russians park an aircraft carrier up there or something to that effect. I mean, that's what we're referring to. That's what we're looking at. Or worse, have the Americans say, let's be big brother and annex sections of it. We can't be thinking that we can allow other people to come into our country and speak with their militaries and try to dictate to us which way we do things. We have a need to develop this country. The American market is closed. The best thing we can do then is to make our market ourselves, to unlock the North. What I'm talking about is going to create an enormous amount of jobs. I'm not telling you that we should be worrying about, how we get the rail from Churchill to the Yukon directly. The first phase is what I've described. We need to get the electricity up there. We need to get the magnetic levitation up there. We need to get the fiber optic cables and all the rest of that up there. We need to get shovels in the ground so that we can dig the deep water port. We need to allow all of the industry that gets out of Alberta to put up the LNG, to put up the refinery and the pipeline and all of the stuff that goes along with that. We need to get out of the way, Mark Carney. You need to move aside. The one thing that this plan will do will solve a lot of problems immediately. It will allow our steel industry to have a place to send its product. It will give them then the resources to build the sheeting style that they need so that they can begin to build ships. Now, we need LNG ships, we need military, we need so much military. Largest coastline in the world, half of it's frozen all the time. We need icebreakers, we need submarines, we need river classes, we need battleships, destroyers, we need all of that. We need so many airplanes, I can't even describe it, not to mention helicopters and all the rest of that. However, to get it started, we have to realize that we have to build to get it ahead, right? To look ahead, not the trickle down of the military, like you heard the witness say. We have to look at it from the other way. So we say to ourselves, we're making a lot of money off the LNG. We surely can be able to build an icebreaker here. We hire somebody from Finland to show us how they do it, and then we do it that way, or we improve on it, or whatever it happens to be. And the next thing you know, Canada is producing its own icebreakers and its own ships. We take the money that we're generating from that, tax dollars wise, and the government then invests in a shipyard somewhere else so that we can build Navy ships and submarines. We put a submarine base up there, all the while building the infrastructure of the magnetic levitation, which of course some genius will figure out a way to make even more and more efficient. And the next thing you know, you can take a magnetic levitation from Vancouver to Toronto. You're there in a half a day. These are the kinds of projects that she's referring to. This is the kind of forward thinking that we're talking about. Now, I don't like to sound immodest, but I am absolutely 100% sure that this is the kind of problem solving that it needs to be applied if we want to take this nation to great heights. And no matter what you say, if you're living in Quebec, there's nothing I said in this that you could not still separate, and we wouldn't miss it, if I'm honest with you. Like, if I'm completely candid with you, there's nothing in here that would impact your sovereignty or any of that stuff. So you don't have to worry about getting all bent out of shape over it. I know that you tried to get a rail going in, a high-speed rail coming out of Quebec City, and yet Via Rail has just canceled its nonstop from Montreal to Toronto because there's no cultural train taking, which again, we can fix with this design, because rather than drive your truck in the ice cold, it gets cold up there. It's hard to get a vehicle started. Most time of the year, people travel around on snowmobiles rather than they do in vehicles. We need to realize that that's okay. There is plenty of adaptation that we can go through to make that happen. Churchill is an excellent spot for a deep water port, which will then allow us to sell our LNG into Europe. It will allow us to take control of the freight line that they want to. That's what it boils down to about the North. I forgot to mention that, but it's half the time to get from Europe to China, where they make everything, if we sail through the northern part of Canada. And that's why you hear so many people arguing about Arctic sovereignty. We need to take control of that. We need to have sovereignty over our own waters, over our own soil. And the best and brightest way that we can do that is to begin at the beginning. And we have 3 projects right here that will probably take 5 to 10 years to get up and running. If we can get the if we start now, we can probably have a lot of it done within 5 years. If we can get the Liberal government out of the way, that will generate enormous amounts of money. With that money, we can reinvest it, and we can actually do what Mark Carney is pretending that he understands. Now, I know it might sound grandiose, and I know it might sound like some random YouTuber who thinks he's got it all figured out, but I believe that what I've just said will work. And I have believed it for quite a long time, as a matter of fact. Remember, the keys are the fact that it's easier to put a magnetic levitation. It travels at 500 kilometers, not 300 kilometers. Yes, it has its limitations on how much freight it can carry, but at 500 kilometers an hour, we can simply send more of them. Anyway, that's just my opinion. You can let me know what you think down in the comments. I'm going to wrap here. Thank you for listening. I will talk to you next time.